increase the world's population, or that we are trying to proselytize broadly to increase fertility rates. And neither one of those things is true. If we are on the Titanic right now, no matter what, the Titanic hits the iceberg. We are trying to, one, make people aware that the Titanic's about to hit an iceberg, get them in lines by the rafts, the ones who want to survive, start getting the rafts in the water in a calm and orderly fashion before people start panicking, because that's what's going to happen. And so what we promote is trying to get, I mean, I know my family's going to be okay. You know, I know that my cultural group is going to be okay. Broadly speaking, so one, I know that my family, you know, if I have 8 kids and they have 8 kids and you do that for 11 generations, that's more descendants than exist in the world today, I often say. So I don't need to worry about people like me. The reason I'm so loud about this is because I'm worried about the massive collapse in cultural and ethnic diversity the world is about to see. And it will be astonishing for people. I think in the far future that there were more than like 3 ethnic groups and 3 cultural groups or something like that, if we don't solve this. And so what we're trying to do is just make people aware of this, because so much of the propaganda that people are consuming is telling them things are fine, have less kids, you're a good person if you have less kids. And I know you've talked about this before on the show, and it is astonishing. And I think when we look at this urban monoculture that is erasing all of the genuine diversity in our society, one of its core messages is negative utilitarianism. The core evil thing in the world is human suffering, and that human happiness just doesn't really matter, or it is largely outweighed by human suffering, and therefore it's better if humans don't exist. And that's the end goal for the urban monoculture, I think, for a lot of people.
What do you mean when you say urban monoculture?
Well, okay, so this sort of gets down into like my personal politics to some extent, but I think that if you look at society right now, it's largely becoming divided into 2 factions, and there has been a major political shift around what conservative and progressive means. The progressive is the party of this urban monoculture, which is a single sort of cultural group or virus that infects other cultural institutions and erases whatever makes them unique and aligns all of their goals. So if I talk with a progressive Muslim or a progressive Jew or a progressive Catholic, or a progressive Unitarian Universalist, and I scratch beneath the surface, often their morals, their views on gender, their views on what future they want for the world are all very, very similar. If I look at conservatives from each of those factions, their worldviews are very different. And what the conservative party seems optimized around, so where the liberal party is optimized around the goals of this monoculture, so spreading the monoculture and reducing in the moment human suffering. That's why they promote things like HAES, you know, like don't tell somebody that it's unhealthy to be fat because that could hurt their feelings in the moment, even though like obviously it's bad for them in the long term. But the conservative movements all have in very distinct cultural histories, which they are trying to preserve. And that is often, if I look at the conservative movement today, it's an alliance of these older traditions and newer but deviant and distinct traditions that are trying to maintain cultural fidelity and exist 100, 200 years from now. And so when I talk about the monoculture, that's what I'm talking about. This thing that wants to, when my kids go to school, say, this is what correct morality is. This is the way you should see the world. And if your parents are telling you anything else, they're deplorable and wrong.
Is that not the case with some factions from a conservative side as well, though?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I call them sleeper progressives. They just want to erase all other cultures the moment they gave power. But I think that right now I can form an alliance with them because our goals are aligned. I think one of the really cool things that we've seen with the conservative party is you saw something like when Andrew Tate converted to Islam. You know, in the past, a conservative icon converting to Islam, a lot of people would have been wringing their hands about that. But a lot of people were like, you go, you know, at least you found some faith, at least you found some tradition. And so I think what we're seeing there is more of a realization that the big bad these days is this culture that's trying to homogenize the world.
Interesting. What would you say to the well-meaning people from the progressive movement that say it feels a little bit bad to be tarnished with the brush as a super virus? I think that I'm just somebody that holds liberal values. I don't believe that I'm part of some destructive force within the world.
And I think that there are people who genuinely, like within any movement, you know, when the Catholic Church used to be the iteration of this in European society, and they were trying to convert everyone to their ways, and the Protestant Church during their own time had periods like that in some countries. the vast majority of Protestants or Catholics in those countries were just decent, well-meaning people trying to live their lives. But the ones who controlled the cultural institutions and were, burning people at the stake and trying to ensure that everybody fit this very narrow definition of morality set by their culture, to me, they were the evil ones within those institutions. And today, when I talk about this monoculture, I think that the vast majority of people who are members of it are just like the vast majority of Catholics and Protestants during periods when those cultural groups were dominant in specific regions.
Why is this culture so effective?
Very interesting. Okay, so it's evolved a lot of new tactics that have never been tried before. So in our book, The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, what we essentially do is we argue that humanity can be thought of as sort of an evolving firmware, which is like our biology, our genes. But on top of that firmware, there's evolving sets of software. And this software, today we often talk about memes as like things that infect somebody and then cause them to just turn around and infect other people. But historically, most mimetic clusters actually augmented a person's sort of biological fitness, the number of surviving offspring they had, and that's how they survived. That's how, if you look at things with a secular mindset, why things like Islam and Judaism figured out stuff like hand washing literally centuries before science figured out hand washing. And you see this across these traditions. For example, if you look at all of the old traditions, almost all of them have some arbitrary self-denial holiday, like Lent or Ramadan or Feast of the Firstborn or whatever, right? And just now, after throwing out all of those rituals over the past, 50, 100 years, secular society's like, oh, now we got to have our juice cleanses. Now we got to have our, they're realizing fasting and stuff like that, right? It has positive mental effects. And so I think that if you see these as different, like evolving cultural groups, this super virus evolved some very unique tactics, and it is not the same thing as the historic progressive movement. What it is something, so the reason I call it a super virus is it is very much so, when you talk about a super bacteria or a super bug, they typically come up in things like hospitals, where you have a ton of people with a weakened immune system, all in a similar environment with lots of sort of viruses or bacteria that can intermingle alongside antibiotics and stuff like that. This is what was created by the internet. This is why all of this stuff started when social media happened. Essentially, you had a super spreader environment where new mimetic ideas were able to test themselves against all of the world's traditions at the same time, optimize and react very quickly, and become incredibly virulent while evolving strategies that had never been tried before. So one of the most effective strategies that it uses is, if you look historically, if you look at cultural groups as sort of like nodal clouds that sort of overlap with each other, when you had a corrupted node within a nodal cloud, or a node that looked like it was flipping, what you would do if you were a majority Protestant country or majority Catholic country, like a Catholic came in and started preaching, or a Protestant came in and started preaching, you'd burn them. You'd burn them at the stake often, right? Or if somebody just had like random cultural mutation, in the same way you have like random genetic mutation, and they believe something weird, like they were a witch, and you burn them, right? That's how you maintained this level of cultural fidelity. What the virus does, which is very interesting, is it organically determines when a node looks like it might be flipping, and then it essentially shadow bans the node. It begins to deconnect that node's links to all of the rest of the network's power structures. And this is really powerful, because what it means is the other nodes that might be allied with that node, they don't react the way they would have historically when somebody was being like burned at the stake or something like that, which is actually why cancellation is a fairly ineffective tactic and genuinely not used that much when contrasted with just this shadow banning process of the person just doesn't get a promotion if it looks like they might be immune to these ideas. They just don't, their papers get published a little less. Certain platforms begin to favor them less within the algorithm. And that's how it has been able to maintain such control, I think, of the upper echelons of our society.
But it's not like every organization is run by a progressive movement, right? There are organizations out there that seem to be a lot more open to new ideas. We're seeing pushback from a variety of places. The opportunity for people to have independent jobs.
So I would say that it's not every organization. So it specifically targets the organizations it can best use to maintain its population levels. And so those are typically organizations that are involved in education. So you're looking at the middle school system, the high school system, and the college system are the organizations that it is most critical that it maintains an absolute stranglehold over. And this again comes to fertility issues. Of the populations of the world, if there is one population that has a very low birth rate, it is this population, this urban monoculture. Because of that, the only way it can repopulate its ideological faction is through siphoning children from other, often more conservative cultural traditions, or in other ways, deviant cultural traditions that are, for whatever reason, having a lot of kids.